The curtain closed to the sound of cheers and applause as Ira Aldridge said the final words in Shakespeare's Othello. It was like any other winter night in St. Petersburg in 1858, until it wasn't. After returning to his dressing room, Aldridge received word that he had been invited to Count Fyodor Petrovich Tolstoy's home. Count Tolstoy was the vice president of the Imperial Academy of Art and had access to some of the most brilliant minds in all of Russia. Aldridge beamed as he read the invitation, excited to learn of one of the other guests who would be in attendance, Taras Shevchenko.
Hi, young historians. It's time for another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. In this episode, we're taking a look at an old story that in many ways reflects a very important moment in history happening now. Ukraine and its people have had a long and difficult relationship with Russia. The character in today's story wrote about the difficulties the Ukrainians faced over 150 years ago. We're going to explore his story, and along with it, the friendship Taras Shevchenko enjoyed with someone else we've talked about before on this podcast, Ira Aldridge. In some ways, their stories are very similar. They both left home to pursue their dreams in other countries. They also both faced many hardships and had to overcome many challenges to make history. As you listen to this story, think about how the stories between these two people are similar. And also, think about how they are different. These similarities can help us understand the paths these two men took to overcome adversity and accomplish their goals. Their stories can teach us a lesson about how to achieve the impossible. But you'll have to pay close attention. So, let's get to the story.
Before we learn of the friendship that blossomed between Ira Aldridge and the famed national poet and artist, we need to rewind and start at the beginning. Taras Shevchenko was born on March 9, 1814 in Morinci, Ukraine, when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. Shevchenko's early life was far from pleasant. He was born into a family of serfs, or agricultural laborers who were owned by a landowner, and was later orphaned at the age of 12. As a serf, Shevchenko did not have access to education and was forced into work at a young age. It was only through the help of the village precentor, who worked at the local church, that Shevchenko learned to read. It was clear from early in his life that Shevchenko had an artistic mind. Although he was often beaten for wasting time drawing, his owner, Pavel Engelhardt, saw that young Shevchenko showed promise as an artist. At the age of 14, Engelhardt sent Shevchenko to apprentice for an artist in St. Petersburg for 4 years. It was during these 4 years that Shevchenko's life took a turn. St. Petersburg offered a new and exciting environment for Shevchenko. The bustling street, beautiful architecture, and the statues that lined the capital's imperial gardens were like a paradise to the young artist, who spent most of his time alone, sketching and bringing to life his new environment. But Shevchenko was not always alone. Far from it. In St. Petersburg, he met famous artists like Yevhen Rebinka, Ivan Soshenko, and the famous painter and professor Karl Bryulov. Bryulov took particular interest in Shevchenko and, together with his friends, sought to buy Shevchenko's freedom. But Engelhardt, Shevchenko's owner, knew that his serf had promise as an artist and set the price for his freedom at an astronomical price. But Bryulov was determined to earn his friend's freedom and eventually sold a painting and used the proceeds to buy Shevchenko's freedom. As a newly freed man, Shevchenko enrolled in the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg under the supervision of his friend Bryulov. In 1840, Shevchenko published his first collection of poetry, followed by 2 more collections in later years. Shevchenko's poetry was greatly inspired by his homeland of Ukraine. While visiting relatives in 1843, Shevchenko became greatly upset by the conditions of Ukraine and the lack of interest the Russian Tsar had on the Ukrainian people. Through his poetry, Shevchenko found a way to express his feelings toward his countrymen while also bringing attention to the life of the Ukrainian people. But poetry wasn't the only way Shevchenko worked through his feelings. During his time in Ukraine, he also produced a series of etchings which he called Picturesque Ukraine in 1844. Shortly after his trip to Ukraine, Shevchenko graduated from the Imperial Art Academy and began traveling as a member of the Kiev Archaeographic Commission. As a member, he was tasked with sketching historic monuments, collecting folktales, and other materials relating to the customs and habits of the local people. This assignment led him back to his homeland of Ukraine, where Shevchenko was more than happy to collect information from the country he loved so dearly. As Shevchenko traveled across Ukraine, he began to realize firsthand how the Russian leadership had no interest in taking care of the Ukrainian people. To combat his anger towards the Tsar and government, Shevchenko wrote several poems putting down Russia's management of Ukraine and the misfortune that had befallen the Ukrainian people. There was a time when in Ukraine even distress would dance, and sorrow in a tavern drank in honeyed brandy's trance. There was a time when life was good in that Ukraine of ours. Recall it then, perhaps the heart may briefly bathe in flowers. His poetry was never meant to be consumed by the public. It was personal confession of the disappointment and tragedy that he saw around him. It wasn't until Shevchenko joined the secret Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood that he learned he was not alone with his disappointment in the way the Ukrainians were being treated. The Brotherhood believed in a series of reforms that would abolish serfdom and bring equality to the nations under Russian rule. The ideas proposed by the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood were radical, but Shevchenko found that he could no longer stand by as Ukraine was left to rot. During one of the society's secret meetings, a Russian loyalist listened in horror through the thin walls as the Brotherhood discussed their ideals. Reform? Education of the peasantry? Abolishing serfdom? These were not just ideas, these were words of revolution. On April 5, 1847, Shevchenko was arrested and his poetry was confiscated. As part of his sentencing into exile, Shevchenko was forced into military service. But Tsar Nicholas took Shevchenko's punishment one step further. The Tsar was so upset by Shevchenko's poetry that he forbid Shevchenko to write, draw, or sketch during his exile. But that did not stop the artist. No, instead, during the 4-year period where he was stationed near the Caspian Sea, Shevchenko made drawings and paintings that depicted the life of the indigenous Kazakh people. Even after being transferred to a new location while Shevchenko was being watched more closely, he continued to draw and write. It wasn't until 1857, 10 years after his sentencing, that Shevchenko was released from his exile. Forbidden from living in Ukraine, the artist and poet found a home in St. Petersburg among his old friends and colleagues. Even though he remained under government surveillance for the rest of his life, Shevchenko lived a mostly normal life in Russia. He continued to paint, meet with friends, and attended the theater. And it was during the opening night of Othello in 1858 that Shevchenko first saw Ira Aldridge in the leading role. In a letter to a friend, Shevchenko wrote, "The African actor is here now. He does wonders on the stage. He shows us the living Shakespeare." Shevchenko was so moved by Aldridge's performance that he attended nearly all of Aldridge's 31 performances in St. Petersburg. But what Shevchenko didn't know was that the American-born actor had also become a deep admirer of the poet and artist. During his time in Russia, Aldridge had heard stories of Shevchenko's life, poetry, artwork, and desire for the abolishment of serfdom. Shevchenko's life struck a chord with Aldridge, who used his acting career to fight the enslavement of people around the world. Aldridge felt the rush of excitement as he arrived to Count Tolstoy's home after one of his performances. He arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. Thinking he was late, Aldridge quickly took off his coat and scanned the room, anxious to find Shevchenko. There, from across the room, Aldridge spotted the poet and made his way toward him. The artists faced one another as silence filled the room. Aldridge extended his hand and the men embraced, laughing. Guests at the party were stunned as they watched the men meet for the first time. It was like watching two old friends reuniting. Oblivious to the party around them, the men sat on the sofa and began talking with the help of a translator. One guest recalled the encounter as follows. Aldridge turned to the guests and began reciting a monologue from Macbeth, which was banned in St. Petersburg. Then everyone sang together down the Mother Volga. Then the tragedian asked Shevchenko to sing about Ukraine. He began singing and Aldridge started to sing along with his wonderful baritone, easily catching the melody of a Ukrainian song unknown to him. It seemed that an instant friendship had been forged between the artists upon their first encounter. They had similar backgrounds and both used their past pain to propel their art forward. Both men had experienced the trauma of slavery and the relief of freedom, and many historians believed this is what brought the men close. But even within the comforts of finding a dear friend, neither man was forgetful of what they were fighting for. Across the ocean, black men, women, and children were still held in the shackles of enslavement. While just a train ride away from the Shevchenko's apartment in St. Petersburg, Ukrainians were suffering under the leadership of Russian rule. The two artists knew that they fought for the same things: freedom and equality for their people back home. "15-year-old Ekaterina F. Young, daughter of Count Tolstoy, who often acted as the poet and tragedian's translator, wrote heavily on the men's friendship in her diary.
Shevchenko could not help becoming Aldridge's friend. They had very much in common. Both were pure, honest souls. Both had in their memories of youth gloomy pages of oppression. One, in order to get to the fervently loved theater, took a valet's job with an actor. The other was flogged because he used a piece of candle when he drew."
In her diary, Ekaterina mentioned how Shevchenko and Aldridge would meet even if she was unable to interpret for them. Shevchenko couldn't speak English and Aldridge didn't understand a word of Russian or Ukrainian and even had trouble pronouncing Shevchenko's name. But the men got along nonetheless, and as a token of their friendship, Shevchenko offered to paint Aldridge's portrait. There are many portraits of Ira Aldridge, but the drawing by Shevchenko stands out. Using an Italian pencil, chalk, and a brown background, the portrait is breathtaking. Unlike other images of Aldridge, Shevchenko drew his friend wearing a fitted jacket, a white shirt, and a bow tie. Aldridge appears calm and relaxed, and his eyes have a gentle look to them, as if he was staring through the page and addressing his audience, just as he did on stage. But while Aldridge may appear calm in the portrait, the experience of drawing the actor was not an easy one for Shevchenko. In her diary, Ekaterina recalled,
"Aldridge began to squirm. We cried out to him that he had to sit at attention. He made faces and we could not keep from laughing. Shevchenko angrily stopped his work. Aldridge made a frightened face and once again sat for a while without moving."
Shevchenko discovered that forcing Aldridge to stay still was not an easy task. While Shevchenko was serious in all business, Aldridge was playful and wanted to make sure his friend did not work too hard. In the end, the drawing of Aldridge was a success, and even though Shevchenko was the one creating the drawing, both men's signatures can be found on the portrait, demonstrating the true sense of collaboration between the two men. Sadly, Shevchenko and Aldridge said farewell to one another on February 28, 1861, unaware that it would be their final goodbye. A few months later, Shevchenko died on March 10, 1861. He passed away shortly after securing the freedom of his relatives, unaware that serfdom would be abolished only a few weeks after his death. Shevchenko is remembered today as Ukraine's national poet and remains an inspiration to the poets, writers, and artists around the world. His love of country and passion for a free Ukraine live on to this day, as his words remain an anthem for freedom and justice.
Welcome back. What did you learn in this story? Did you remember to make notes of any similarities between this story and the story of Ira Aldridge? If you haven't listened to the episode about Ira yet, that's okay. You can go back and listen to his story anytime and learn even more about his incredible accomplishments. As the modern story of Ukraine and Russia unfolds, try to keep Taras Shevchenko's story in mind. Think about the courage it took for him to write about the injustices the Ukrainians faced in the 1800s. Do you think there are people in Ukraine now who will stand up against injustice? We sure do. In fact, ask your parents and teachers about some people you can read about who are standing up now. We'll bet you'll learn about some more brave people who are doing the right thing in spite of the incredible challenges they face. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more, you can read issue 14 of Honest History magazine. You'll learn about the history of this region, and then you can do your own research and dive into the history behind Russia and Ukraine even further. This episode was hosted by Ben Brainard and written by Brooke Knight. Production was led by Randall Lawrence. To learn more about this episode, including more about the host, visit us at honesthistorymag.com and follow along for updates on social media at Honest History.